I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on BIDEN television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on BIDEN television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on BIDEN television. Coming to you from London, but discussing the United States of America, or rather, the impact of a change of president on the rest of the world. It's all over, bar the shouting and the lawsuits and the recounts, and we can't rule out, at least the betting markets haven't, that Donald Trump will somehow re-emerge from the chaos of the US presidential election for a second term. But the highly likely outcome is that Joe Biden will be the president of the US come January. And we're going to discuss today what impact that might have on the rest of the world. Well, less impact than it once might have had, because US political, economic, perhaps even military strength is not the overwhelming hegemon that it was, say, in the 1990s. There are other players, and those players are getting stronger as the United States gets weaker. But obviously, the impact of new policies, new approaches by an American president will play out across the world. It may be that it will be a positive thing. For example, in Iran, it's highly likely that a new American presidency will seek to re-enter somehow the nuclear deal with Iran, where all the other parties wanted to continue it. Iran wanted to continue it, but Donald Trump ripped it up in plain sight. Ditto the Paris Climate Agreement, although the outcome of the Senate runoffs in Georgia will be crucial to the outcome of that one. But it is possible that the United States will re-engage with the issue of climate change with most of the rest of the international community. It's quite likely that the unhinged rhetoric against China of Donald Trump will be replaced perhaps by an equally unhinged rhetoric against Russia instead of China. It's quite likely that the policy towards Latin America will remain unchanged. There'll probably be a new attempt to kiss and make up with the former European allies of the United States. I say former, although on paper they still are. The fireworks that went off across all the European capitals when the election result hoved into view tells you something about what the European governments, perhaps with the exception of Britain, felt about the Donald Trump era, which may not, of course, even be over. Even if he loses this one, he's threatening to make a comeback in 2024. But the impact of the Obama, Biden, Clinton gang should not be seen through rose-colored glasses. The US bombers might have the rainbow flag painted on their tail fins, but that doesn't mean that they're going to fly less often or with less devastating effect. In fact, it has to be acknowledged, though most liberals and progressives will not acknowledge it, Donald Trump was a far less warlike president than those that preceded him. In fact, he's the first president, for as long as I can remember, and I can remember a long time, not to start a new war, even though he prosecuted existing wars, sometimes against his better judgment. The Pentagon official who just in the last days revealed that he had lied to President Trump in order to stop him rapidly withdrawing forces from Afghanistan and Syria, is regarded as a liberal hero, oddly. It's a liberal thing to do, to lie to your president, to keep a war going. So, Charles Shoebridge, you're a security expert in the world of intelligence, and so on, writer, broadcaster. Have I summed up some of the main changes that might occur in your view?
Yes, I think very much that we're quite likely to see a change in style, that's for sure. Probably less overtly confrontational, more subtle, perhaps more collegiate in terms of, as you mentioned, his European allies or future European allies working together, or at least trying to get them on board and being more concerned than in the Trump days about whether people were on board with the US or not. Whether that is the same as bringing forth a change of substance, I think, as you've kind of hinted at, is I think, a very different matter. When we look at Trump's record, Trump, of course, did make some achievements, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure. Not least, of course, as you mentioned, being the first president for a very long time not to actually start a new war, which was, of course, a manifesto promise for him that he did actually keep. But as soon as I think he started appointing, shall we say, people such as Pence, Pompeo, even John Bolton, you knew that he was going to soon be, probably because of his intense, really profound ignorance of international affairs, I think. Not business affairs, for sure, but because of Trump's lack of experience and knowledge of international affairs when he came in to office, he surrounded himself, and as people like myself, and I think yourself, predicted, really at the very beginning of his presidency, that he would be very much, if you like, captured by this foreign and security policy establishment, if we can call it that.
The swamp.
The swamp, as he called it, that he said he would drain, and of course he actually became literally a part of it, and even singing its praises and really acting not exactly as a puppet, but a lot of the time effectively as a hostage for that establishment. And we saw again and again his, what might be seen as good intentions, or perhaps acting in a way that appeared to him to be right, being constrained again and again by policy considerations. And of course, we saw that particularly, of course, in respect of his dealings with Russia, where we ended up with a presidency that was actually more anti-Russia than possibly previous ones have been, and perhaps even the future one will be, at least in terms of its overt hostility. And of course, he had to be put in that position because he was forced to be on the defensive as being accused, again, largely without evidence, of being extremely pro-Russia, and therefore, of course, he had to react in an opposite way. And it's that kind of, if you like, that tension between the foreign and security establishment, which hasn't changed over any Republican or Democrat administrations over the years. That the tension between those factors, which have been there for such a long time and probably still will be, and Trump's instincts to actually make things better and certainly deal with leaders on a personal basis. That tension, I think, has led to pretty much the chaos that we've had over the last 4 years. Trump is a strong individual for sure, but he absolutely was not strong enough to assert his own path through the swamp that he himself described.
They weren't setting off fireworks in Saudi Arabia. In fact, the Crown Prince cancelled the Trump victory party that he had planned, and that's partly because Biden made a pre-election pledge to end support for the Saudi war against Yemen. This feeds in, of course, to the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. If Biden goes back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, that's going to be a big loss for Saudi Arabia, isn't it?
It is, not because of the deal itself, but because what they fear, and what Israel, of course, particularly fears, is that once Iran is readmitted to, shall we say, the international community, by which, of course, we mean that it has dealings not with the international community, because those have largely never been fettered or tied, but certainly better relations with the West, particularly Europe. That will be a diplomatic and geostrategic blow for Israel as much as it is for Saudi Arabia. But I think in specific terms with Saudi Arabia, I think just as we saw with Trump, economic factors will triumph, and you've got a vile dictatorship by any measure, I think, when I'm talking about Saudi Arabia here, that regardless of its record and regardless of what it's doing at the moment, when we think about Khashoggi, the killing there, when we think about Yemen and so on, that you have got a situation where this is an extremely wealthy country, that Trump and I'm sure Biden will not want to lose the customs of, particularly when it comes to supplying of oil and also the supply the other direction of weapons and other projects.
Jacques Arnold, my former colleague in Parliament, Conservative Member of Parliament for 10 years, nowadays a consultant in Latin American affairs. Did you set off any fireworks at the result of the American election?
No, there was a certain inevitability to it. Because of the abrasive way that Trump carries on, he maximised the vote of his opponents. He did maximise his own as well, and the figures...
His vote went up 7 million.
The figures he achieved are quite remarkable and quite salutary as to what the American people are thinking. So we watch with interest. At the end of the day, the democracy of the United States will prevail and they will have chosen a president. But the new president, Biden, faces in many ways the same problems, but is facing a world that has changed in his lifetime. No longer is the United States a hegemon. It is opposed and competed with, but not only by China, which is so obvious, but by the European Union itself, who fancies itself as one of the big three at the table, or big four if you include the Soviet Union. And I think in the process, it may be that Biden starts in thinking that the current Conservative government is some kind of Trump clone. Well, it isn't. It is a British government. And what he will find is, as with previous decades, the reliable partner in Europe is Britain, and the remaining European Union considers itself a rival to the United States and brings with it the same kind of protective instincts which are highly damaging to international trade.
However, if Saudi Arabia was a loser from the election, the British government was also a loser in this respect. The Obama, Biden, Clinton gang were extremely hostile to Brexit. Obama even came here to interfere in our elections, warning us that we'd go to the back of the queue, as he put it, in terms of a trade deal with the United States. Obama had, with his Kenyan antecedents, feelings about British colonialism that Biden, with his Irish antecedents, also seems to share. I'm sure there were no fireworks in the garden at number 10. How badly is the British government's position vis-à-vis the EU and vis-à-vis the United States imperiled, do you think?
I don't think it is imperiled, because reality will prevail. Britain wants a largely free trade agreement. We have been constrained for decades now by the European continental protectionism, just as America would like a free trade agreement with Britain, and therefore I think reality will break out, even if emotionally it starts off with this obsession that somehow Boris Johnson is a clone of the current and shortly to be previous president.
Ella Rule, you're the chairwoman of the Communist Party in Britain, one of the country's leading left-wing figures. Were you lighting fireworks?
Not exactly, no. I'd been thinking about this before coming, and I recalled a poem that we were all required to learn off by heart at school, which is by La Fontaine, and it was called Le Cocher, le Chat et le Souriceau. And this was a poem about a little mouse that went out into the world for the first time and saw in the distance a beautiful creature with pointed ears like ours, whiskers, a lovely fur and lovely furry tail. And he really wanted to make friends with this creature when he was scared out of his wits by this feathered monster flapping its wings and squawking. And he rushed home to his mother and told her the story. And he said, well, you know, that one that you admired, that was a cat, and that would have eaten you up. The other one is harmless, and we may get to eat him one day. Now, there are certain parallels here, not 100%. If you like, certainly Biden would be like the cat, dangerous. Now, Trump is also dangerous, so that is the difference with the cockerel. He doesn't squawk either. He tweets, but nevertheless, the parallels are there. But you have to see that both Biden and Trump are chief executives of the greatest terrorist criminal organization in the world, US imperialism. And that being the case, you have to ask yourself, do you think the nice, cuddly guy is more dangerous, or do you think the squawking, terrifying one is more dangerous? And I think from my point of view, the nice one, in quotes, is the more dangerous because it projects this American image as the defender of democracy, freedom and all the rest of it, when in actual fact, there's Guantanamo, there's rendition, there's all sorts of things. So there's very little about US imperialism that you could think of as anything other than mafia.
It is remarkable how many people on the left, perhaps not as left as you, but in the Guardian, amongst liberals and so-called progressives, who appear entirely to have forgotten that the Obama-Biden-Clinton administration launched 7 wars, dropped more bombs than George W. Bush. And some of their wars, like Libya, are still raging. Why is that? Is it just the ugliness of Trump that makes the Obama era look cuddlier?
Well, I think it is because Trump is so damn honest. You can act. The left is very much at fault, I feel here, of saying that all the troubles in the world are down to this obvious madman, when in actual fact they're down to US imperialism. I get very annoyed with people who keep saying Trump this, Trump that, we've got to get after Trump. You have to get after US imperialism. It doesn't matter who represents it.
Interesting. Let's go to the United States and talk to Dr. Jim Jennings from Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Jennings is a proper internationalist responding to wars and disasters all over the globe. Dr. Jennings, welcome.
Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Dr. Jennings, should the world care who the next president of the United States is?
The answer to that question is yes. The world should be concerned very much because of either the absence of American leadership, which we've seen in the last 4 years, or the involvement, and perhaps you might say over-involvement of America in international affairs under some earlier presidents. I think that the answer is very simple. If you don't like to be bombed in your homes and in your streets and in your cities and farms even, then you want to be on a good relationship with the United States because there is a huge military capability, and there's been no reluctance to use that in the past decades.
What's the difference in your view between Biden administration and a Trump administration?
Yes, there would be a major difference, and we don't know the shape of it exactly. Joe Biden seems to be a decent man. He's got a lot of experience in Washington. He will have advisors, mostly women, in his cabinet and minorities this time. But I think there is some reason to be concerned if you consider the international landscape. First of all, Mr. Biden was in the Senate for 29 years. He was head of the Foreign Relations Committee in 2001 to 2003, and again in 2007 to 2009. And these were times when very important decisions were taken. And so the question is, can you rely on his judgment? I do believe he's going to heal the civic problems that we have. He's facing a very intimidating set of circumstances with the global pandemic, the economic collapse, and 72 million people in America having voted against him. So it's going to be very difficult.
Considering Trump's attitude towards the Middle East, what changes might we see with a Biden administration?
Right now, it's a very dangerous period. There is an immense and powerful coalition that has been formed to actually overthrow the government of Iran and take the existing government out of action, and to do it in a military way. But it can only happen if led by the United States. But right now we have, after the Arab Spring in Egypt, General al-Sisi came to power and cracked down on the Muslim protesters and killed 1,000 of them. And the Saudi Arabian, I call him a chopping block murderer, Mohammed bin Salman, and Mr. Netanyahu of great infamy over the last 30 years. These three have determined that they will push back against Iran. And if they can get the US to commit to that, then there will be another war in the Middle East against Iran. Now, initially, Mr. Biden says that he wants to restore the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and a nuclear deal with Iran, which Obama put in place and Trump trashed. If he does that, then we'll be on a course for peace. The Democratic Party has been a pro-Zionist party since Harry Truman recognized Israel in 1948. And that drives everything. In 2016, Biden made a speech to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in the United States, in which he said our support for Israel is unconditional.
What about Trump's attitude towards the illegal immigrants into the United States? Can we expect a new dawn of compassion on that from a Biden administration?
Well, I think you have to remember that Mr. Obama had a very heavy-handed immigration policy. He did try to open the way for the young children born in this country to give them a path to citizenship. And Biden has pledged he will do that. In terms of the border, he will free the children who are being held as hostages, taken from their parents, and he will do that. Those are all good steps. But in the long run, the United States Congress will still demand that the borders be secured in a very heavy-handed way.
Jacques, on that point, the children in cages point, again, it's often forgotten that the cages were actually procured by Barack Obama, not by Donald Trump. He just used them. But what will be the impact on Latin America? What do you think the Biden policy towards Latin America will be?
I think Biden will be guided by the continuing fundamental enthusiasm for democracy. You just take Bolivia, for example. Even under Trump, while Trump was president, the Bolivians have voted and have chosen a president themselves. And I think that this kind of thing will continue in the time ahead. Venezuela is a very much separate problem because we're not dealing there with the will of the people. Democracy is at the very least is in abeyance in Venezuela at the moment, but that is a problem for the Venezuelans, not for anybody outside, and I don't think it will be for the new government as it was for the last American government.
Much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on BIDEN Television, coming from London, talking about the US and the world. Charles Shoebridge, as a rough, maybe crude point, I'd say this. There's much less likelihood now of a war with Iran, but there's more likelihood of a resumption of the war in Syria.
I think on the latter point, you're absolutely right, because when you look at an important thing in many ways, and we see this over many years, not just with the US, but countries generally, is to, of course, look at not what they say, but what they actually do. And what we see Biden already doing is pretty much what Trump did as soon as he was in office, and that is that they start appointing advisors and cabinet members who are a particular ideological trait, shall we say. And we can see that already when we look at the people who are already being lined up for Biden's cabinet, in terms of the Susan Rices and other people such as this.
Power, maybe even Hillary Clinton at the UN.
Is being mooted as well, and you imagine that. It's anyway. But when you look at these people, and when you look at actually the people that were working for Trump in similar capacity, no matter what their domestic policy differences may or may not be, in terms of foreign policy, there's a consistent thread goes through there. And that is certainly one of, shall we say, American exceptionalism, of America's self-given role in the world as you pointed out, that it likes to present itself as the promoter and defender of democracy. And of course, in the media, it's constantly presented as that, our Western liberal media, certainly. Even today, bizarrely on this point, I was reading BBC, just seeing what they might say about what the change will be in Biden's policy. And of course, for the BBC and for The Guardian, as others, as you mentioned, the liberal media, it's very much, there'll probably be a return to traditional American foreign policy, which is supporting democracy around the world. And it's almost difficult, if it wasn't so tragic, not to actually laugh when you read that, when you consider the history, not just of the last 4 or 8 years, but decades and decades, arguably a century of American foreign policy, which has had nothing whatsoever to do with the promotion of democracy, other than as a cover for its own interventions. South America is a classic example, perhaps not at this moment, but certainly in historical context.
Well, Jacques have finally elided over the point that the only reason there had to be a new election in Bolivia was because the president, Evo Morales, was overthrown in a coup inspired by Moscow. The people have rejected that coup and re-elected Morales' ally.
Yes, exactly. But the point is that you've got the foreign policy establishment there is not, from what we can see so far, is not going to change. And I think the policies are effective, even though Trump was far more brash about this in terms of being America first, and he absolutely went for that. And he also, of course, involved his own personality and in terms of confrontation far more than I think Biden will. But that doesn't mean to say that it's less or more dangerous. And we come back to what you mentioned, your analogy earlier.
The cockerel or the cat. Ella, on that, China has been on the receiving end of endless tongue lashings from Donald Trump. And of course, trade policy, the trade deals are in tatters, ruins. And Huawei is banned, TikTok is banned, and so on. Surely you must think that a Biden presidency will at least turn down the volume with regard to China.
Well, he might turn down the volume, but the fact of the matter is that American imperialism is very much threatened by China. China is a rising power. Whereas American imperialism is decrepit and decaying, China is rising strong. And so whoever's in charge of, whoever the godfather is in America, they're going to want to put these people down. One thinks that probably Biden might be use much more diplomatic means, but all the same, it'll be at least as tough.
I meant to ask you this. What about the possibility of Donald Trump starting a war before he leaves office?
Well, I think there was some concerns about that. Now, don't forget, Donald Trump has never, and this comes back to your earlier question, which you only partly answered, about who is more dangerous. And I think the problem with Trump was this, or there were many problems with Trump, but one of the most obvious ones, I think, and the most concerning, wasn't that he wants to start wars. He made it absolutely clear as part of his policies and as part of his election manifesto before he was elected that he wanted to avoid these wars, but that nonetheless, by his brash actions, by his confrontationalism, by his impulsiveness, that by accident it would have been so easy for him to have triggered wars. Think back to the closest we've probably come to war, certainly with Iran, for example, was absolutely the killing of Soleimani. I mean, an extraordinary, brazen and obviously criminal, many people would argue, but absolutely reckless course of action that, of course, led to Trump having to, embarrassingly in many ways, climb down and allow, as I'm sure is what happened, a missile attack in revenge to take place without being answered by the US, simply to then dial back the rhetoric because a war became so close.
Let's hear from Professor Scott Lucas, who is the professor of US politics at the University of Birmingham. That's Birmingham in England, not in Alabama. He is an American citizen, currently living and teaching in the UK. Professor, I've previously described Donald Trump and Joe Biden as two cheeks of the same backside. What about you? Do you think people should care whether it's one or the other?
Well, thank you, George. I don't think it's a case of America leads and we follow. I mean, we're well past that, if that ever was the case. But I do think that the issues that are of concern inside America are of concern to us around the world. Of course, American foreign policy is of concern to us as it affects our countries. But also, when Americans discuss healthcare, that's an issue which is, of course, of concern to us. Climate change doesn't know borders. It is not just American. So that's an issue of concern. And coronavirus, how you handle the pandemic, you know, the American example where the pandemic has not been handled well. Well, that's something that we have seen in the UK and around the world, and how different countries have either dealt with coronavirus effectively or have not. And I think the question of human rights doesn't stop at borders. So, you know, clearly American issues will be of concern to Americans, but how Americans deal with questions of human rights, that matters to all of us.
Will Biden do better than Donald Trump when it comes to tackling the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I have to be honest with you, George. I think probably you or I could be more effective than Donald Trump in this, because we would at least know the scale of what is occurring and try to deal with it by relying on experts. The simple fact, to start off with Donald Trump before we get to Joe Biden, is that there has not been an effective effort by the federal government to deal with this ever since the pandemic began in the United States in February. It has not coordinated its effort with the states. It has not effectively arranged for a test, track, and trace system. It has not provided for personal protective equipment. It has not dealt effectively with the question of protecting medics or protecting the elderly. Now, can Joe Biden be more effective? On his own, of course not, but that's not the point. It's not just Joe Biden. It's an administration which already in transition has gone to the experts to appoint a task force, the public health experts, the medical experts, the technology experts. It is a transition which has already identified the key issues to deal with: the track and trace issue, the personal protective equipment issue, the coordination with the states, overseeing the distribution of a vaccine if, inshallah, we have one in early 2021. It's a question not of saying a president does this, but you get the people who can handle the pandemic and you give authority to them.
What, in your view, would be the biggest change in the Middle East under a Biden presidency?
I think the first thing to say, George, is that too often we look at the Middle East and say, okay, it's going to change because of what America does, and we look at Washington first. We would need another program for this, and you've had many on that to cover this, where you have to look for changes in the Middle East that come from within, whether that's the question of Lebanon, whether it's the question of the Syrian war now going into its 10th year, whether it's the question of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, or Israel and Palestine. I think, however, with the Biden administration entering into this, we could probably say certain things. First, there's not going to be a significant change in American policy on Israel and Palestine, because at one level, there's not much to change right now. We have not had effective talks probably since 2009. There's no will amongst the Israeli government to go into those talks. The Palestinians are trying to regroup in terms of their leadership, not just because of the death of Saeb Erekat, but the tensions between Fatah and Hamas. I think if you talk about the Syrian conflict, we're past the point now where I think any country, in effect, can, as it were, say, look, that's it, back off, we halt the conflict. I think what we need at this point is the US as one of a number of countries that says, look, we're dealing with a partitioned Syria, in fact, if not if not legally. And how do you protect civilians in all areas of Syria? In the areas in Damascus and those overseen by Assad, in the Kurdish area, and in the opposition area in the northwest. In other words, the first priority in Syria is to save lives. And that's true in Yemen as well. How do you look to the United States? How do they become part of a process to get an effective ceasefire, to get an end to the blockades, to get an end to the bombing that has taken place, to deal with that crisis? And if we go just outside the Middle East, if we talk about Iran, I don't think it is possible because of the makeup of Congress for the Biden administration to immediately go back into the nuclear deal, but it is possible. It is possible to start to discuss like adults the issues that are on the table from the Iranian side, from the US side, and from the region.
And finally, would you agree that the problems facing the United States are largely based on them losing their global hegemony?
I don't buy into the idea of US hegemony. I don't buy into it, at least now, because I think it becomes this artificial thing that traps us into either saying, oh, no, of course, there isn't US hegemony. The US does great things around the world and everybody look to Washington. Alternatively, too often when we have problems, which are, the US might be part of them, but they're problems we need to deal with ourselves, we quite often say, oh, let's just blame the Americans for hegemony. The Americans are not the world superpower. I don't think they ever were. They certainly are not now. I think the important thing is to set up channels of communication that look more in terms of let's deal with American actors, American activists, American NGOs, not just the American president, yes, American businesses, and say, where is the mutual interest here? Not your interest overriding mine, not mine overriding yours, but where is the mutual interest? There is a lot of repair work that needs to be done in Washington, because what Donald Trump did is he trashed the American agencies, he trashed the American system. And I know some people might look at that and say, oh, that's good. America's been terrible in the past. The system should have been trashed. Well, I take a different attitude. America has done bad things in the past, or the American system's done bad things in the past, but it also has been able to work with others to be effective. And if you trash the American system and there's nothing left, there is no chance of cooperation. So in that sense, I'm hoping we get adults in the room. We get adults who discuss according to the rules of cooperation, the rules of the game, which Donald Trump never observed. How can we get a better future for America, for Europe, and for the Middle East?
Jacques, on the coronavirus thing, you right-wing chaps haven't done a very good job. The United States is the worst in the world. Britain is the second worst in the world. Brazil is the third worst in the world. I could go on, believe me. What is it about free market ideology? What is it about, politically speaking, right-wing people that they have, well, completely failed in the face of the virus?
I suppose you take that argument with Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia. And there are many cases. I don't think the issue is ideological. One of the problems we have is that the preparations, the war gaming that was done 3 or 4 years ago was based, as usual, on the flu, and the coronavirus was deemed as something that we're not going to face because it can't travel, and if it does travel, it won't be in sufficient strength. And we are living with the consequence of that. And therefore, I don't think ideology particularly comes into it.
I don't know. New Zealand did very well. South Korea did very well. China did very well. America, Britain, Brazil did very badly.
No, but this is precisely my point, that preparations for dealing with coronavirus did not take place. Had they done so, we would have been in a far better position, and I hope comparable with South Korea and New Zealand itself.
Charles, Trump pulled out, this is your point about how anti-Russian he was and may have been forced to become. Trump trashed the INF treaty. He trashed the open skies policy. He moved the tanks onto Russia's lawn. The possibility, therefore, of a nuclear exchange could not have been ruled out over things like Ukraine. Looked for a moment even like Belarus could be such a trigger. on the big question, I call it the big question with no disrespect to smaller areas, the big question of world war between West and East, Biden's got to be better than Trump, no?
I think what we're going to see is with Biden that you will see a return to what might be called, for better or worse, normality. But I think it's particularly important to Biden. I think Biden sees that it's absolutely important to mend relations with Europe. And that may exclude the UK for the reasons we've said, amongst Brexit and other factors. But I think with mainstream Europe, especially the EU, he wants to mend the relationship with them. And it's Iran more than any other issue, along with style issues in terms of Trump's way of carrying on diplomacy, that I think will drive the Iranian process forward, notwithstanding the difficulties that have been mentioned, for example, around Congress. The other aspect I've mentioned is another influence on Biden, of course, is going to be that there is now a left wing of his party that is actually wanting to support Palestinians, that wants to bring back Iran into the fold. And although that left wing of his party isn't particularly strong, it is stronger than it has been in the past, and they have electoral success. And it may be that there is going to be some influence on having a more moderate policy, shall we say, particularly, I think, in respect of Iran. And if the Iran issue is resolved, even though that will upset Israel, Israel may take it as a fait accompli, but still knowing that behind the scenes it's got absolutely unswerving support from America, but that would allow America and Europe to, I think, mend its ties.
Ella, Trump did well on North Korea, didn't he? I mean, we had the strange situation of the Democrats, supposedly the more left-wing of the two American parties, attacking Trump for trying so hard to deal with the North Korean issues.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the Koreans were dealing with the issues themselves, and there was a rapprochement between North and South. And Trump leapt in, as indeed any US president would have leapt in, to try and keep control of the situation. South Korea is very important to the United States as a base where it keeps its nuclear weapons, and it's got on its side, both aiming at China. If China is going to be contained, it's necessary to keep South Korea on board. And the United States has intervened time and time and time again to stop any rapprochement between North and South. The Korean people themselves, even the South Koreans, the vast majority of them, are actually quite sentimental about the North. They want to be one country. They feel they are one country. And they might have a little disagreement about whether it's going to be a capitalist country or a communist country. But, the policy of, well, one country, two systems, as China's done with Hong Kong, well, maybe that'll work and we can be one Korean people, and as one Korean people we'll be quite a force to be reckoned with. So even South Koreans like that.
But he did do...
Americans don't, and this is why Trump tried to go in and mend fences, but of course it didn't work. Nothing came of it.
Well, except he was the very first American president to set foot on North Korean soil. He seemed to hit it off with the North Korean leader.
Fine. But I don't... But
don't see
still,
Joe Biden doing that, do you?
He would if he thought he could get something out of it. Maybe Trump was naive to think he could get anything out of it, but it was a new tactic to try. Nobody's ever been able to get anything much out of North Korea. They're going to stick by their socialism, and anyone who tries to come along and upend it is going to get pretty short shrift. But so the Americans have tried various things, and Trump said, right, I will go there myself, and he thought he'd make all the difference.
Bearing a hamburger.
But he didn't.
Beware of American presidents bearing hamburgers, hot dogs. Jacques, let me touch on one last issue with you. Although Biden's ancestors left Ireland in 1841 and my own left in around 1921, the feeling of attachment to Ireland never dies, and I'm testament to that. Do you see a problem for the British government in holding on to Northern Ireland now that you've got a US president in place who is committed to Irish reunification. You've got a dynamic now ongoing in relation to the European Union that favours or tends to favour Irish reunification. Do you see the union between Britain and Northern Ireland being damaged or weakened in any way by Joe Biden?
No, I think it will be respected as it has been by all his predecessors of whichever party. It is the will of the people of Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom, and Americans as Democrats will understand that. Emotion is a different matter. He comes from Irish ancestry. He comes from the estates in America where the, if you like, the Southern Irish lobby is very strong. He has an emotional tie-up, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. But he will, as president, be very sensible about who his friends are and about self-determination, which is at the disposal of the Northern Irish, as it always has been.
Charles, finally with you, Trump has been a disaster for the Palestinian people. He scrapped the meager aid that the United States was giving, plunging millions of Palestinians further into penury. He moved the embassy, which all of his predecessors had said they would do, but none of them did. He went around his friends in the Arab satrapies, browbeating and bullying them into so-called peace deals with Israel when they had never actually ever been at war with Israel, but it was called a peace deal. And of course, Jared Kushner's deal of the century, steal of the century. What happens to these things now that we get a change of president?
I think what you'll see is, again, more of the same in terms of the actual substance of policy, but less assertively and overtly promoted. I think you're going to see that, I mean, I would be quite surprised if the embassy was to move back, for example. I can't see that once these things have been done. I think there might be some feeling of relief amongst the, what might be called, ironically, the more neocon wing of the Democrat Party, of whom there are many powerful proponents, it should be said, many of whom I think will be in positions of influence and power under Biden. I think there will be relief that this was carried out by Trump and not by their own president. So I think a lot of the factors won't change, but I think there will be an understanding in Israel that there has been some change with Biden's election, and that even though the substantive relationship between America and Israel isn't going to change as such, I mean, it's an unconditional commitment to Israel, as we've seen consistently through history or recent history, that there will have to be some changes in the management and the public face of that relationship. And that's particularly, I think, in terms of the Palestinians. And I mentioned earlier that we've got this more, shall we say, Palestine-aware group that's now part of the US Democrat Party that actually can influence future policy. And I think what Biden will want to be doing is he will want to be seen to be acting more in a impartial way. It won't be impartial, and the US never, in the US and in Israel or the Middle East or in any other parts of the world, it's never been an honest broker. And arguably no state can be, of course, especially a powerful state like that, because it's pursuing its own interests. But nonetheless, I think he will be wanting to at least give the impression that the US is acting as an honest broker, and in that way can get more general support from particularly the West and particularly Europe.
But does Kushner's deal, for example, die?
I think Kushner's deal may die on the vine anyway, because it's largely rejected. It's something that has to be accepted by at least the Palestinian leaders, if not by the Palestinian people themselves. But that doesn't mean to say that in the next 4 years we're going to get a replacement for it. But whether it becomes actually part of what's becomes, if you like, on the ground actually happening in Palestine is, I think, a different matter. I think you will see that the Palestinians will, at least on the face of it, be one of the beneficiaries of a Biden presidency. But I think that as part of a general plan to bring former allies back together again, especially with Europe, then you will get a situation, I think, where that can be moderated or perhaps not enacted as a means of bringing people back together. That doesn't mean to say, and I emphasize it again and again, that I think the relationship between the US and Israel will be any different. And especially, I think that you won't have a situation that we had arise with Obama to some degree, where there was that personal animosity between Netanyahu.
Although Netanyahu humiliated Joe Biden, he chose a moment when Joe Biden was in Israel to announce the gigantic new settlement block, which I don't think the Obama-Biden gang have forgotten. Last question to you. Does Saudi Arabia join the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan in recognizing Israel?
That's a very difficult question. You could toss a coin on that, I think. I think that there may be less demand now with Biden, but that doesn't mean to say it might not happen, simply because it helps to bring stability there, but also because, let's face it, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, especially in foreign and security policy, has been as close over the last few years as it possibly could be.
Yeah.
These are not enemies, but whether they would take the step to actually formalize that, which in practical terms wouldn't have a great deal of difference, might be pushing the Saudi royal family's chances with its domestic audience too far at this stage.
Continuing to have an affair but not getting married.
Not being caught, I think, openly, exactly.
Well, lots more to come, of course, on this as we await the incoming Biden administration. Unless, of course, the fat lady does sing and the fat ladies in the Supreme Court of the United States rob Joe Biden of his presidency, in which case all of this discussion has been entirely otiose. But I hope you enjoyed it in any case. I've been George Galloway. This is Kalima Horra, and you have been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.